What if I told you that some of the richest nations in the world are also some of the most indebted? As of 2024, the United States, the world's largest economy, owes over $35 trillion and counting. Japan, a staggering debt-to-GDP ratio of over 250%. And yet, they're not collapsing. In fact, they're thriving. So, how much national debt is too much for a country? Welcome to a Clash of Minds, where we don't just ask questions, we ask the questions. Let's talk about it. Before we dive into the danger zones, let's get clear on the basics. National debt isn't like your credit card bill. It's the total amount a government owes to creditors, domestic and foreign, usually in the form of bonds. It builds up when governments spend more than they collect in taxes. But here's the kicker. National debt is not always a sign of irresponsibility. In fact, debt is a fundamental part of modern economies. It fuels infrastructure, education, research, defense. It smooths over crises, like the pandemic. It can even stimulate growth, if used wisely. Think of national debt as a tool, and like any tool, a hammer can build a house, or shatter a window. To answer, how much is too much, we need a measuring stick, and that's where the debt-to-GDP ratio comes in. This ratio compares a country's total debt to the value of goods and services it produces annually. Imagine earning $50,000 a year, but owing $100,000. Your debt-to-income ratio is 200%. Economists look at countries the same way. So, is there a magic number? Economists have disputes on whether there's a simple threshold, which affects growth prospect. On the other hand, the Treaty on European Union, also known as the Maastricht Treaty, set a 60% reference as a criteria to adopt euro as currency. However, this rule has been increasingly challenged, particularly in the wake of global financial crises and periods of low interest rates. Japan has a ratio of over 250% and maintains stable interest rates. Italy, with 140%, faces periodic crises. The U.S., sitting above 120%, still borrows at historically low rates. So clearly, context matters. Here's what separates manageable debt from dangerous debt. It's not just how much you owe. First of all, it's the currency you borrow in. If you borrow in your own currency, like the US, UK, or Japan, you can always print more to pay it back. That's a huge advantage. Countries like Argentina, which borrow in foreign currencies like the US dollar, have far less control. That's when defaults happen. Secondly, it's the interest rate. If rates are low, debt is cheap. Servicing it costs less. But if rates rise, as we've seen post-2021, it gets painful, fast. Thirdly, it's the investor confidence. Do markets trust that you'll repay? Countries with a reputation for stability can borrow more at better rates. Once trust falters, borrowing costs explode. Case in point, Greece during the 2010 Eurozone crisis. Last but not least, it's the economic growth. If your economy is growing faster than your debt, you're in good shape. If debt grows faster than the economy, that's when alarm bells ring. Not all debt is created equal. If a government borrows to invest, say, in high-speed rail, green energy, education, these are assets that pay for themselves over time. They boost productivity, raise incomes, and eventually reduce debt burdens. But if a government borrows just to cover ongoing expenses, without raising future revenue or growth, it's like borrowing to pay your rent every month. Sooner or later, it catches up to you. Ask yourself, is the country borrowing to build the future, or to delay the present? Let's rewind history. During World War II, the U.S. had a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 100%. And yet, it entered a golden age of growth after the war. How? Because the economy boomed and productivity soared. Similarly, Germany after reunification in the 1990s took on massive debt. Today, it's one of Europe's strongest economies. Even Britain, during the Napoleonic Wars, ran up debt levels over 200% of GDP. The British Empire still managed to dominate the 19th century. The takeaway: high debt is not a death sentence. It depends on what comes next: growth, reforms, productivity. However, when national debt spirals to unsustainable levels, it can trigger a cascade of negative consequences. First off, high debt can crowd out private investment by increasing borrowing costs and creating uncertainty about future tax burdens. Besides, heavily indebted countries are more susceptible to economic downturns and external shocks. A sudden increase in interest rates or a sharp decline in economic growth can make debt servicing much more difficult, potentially leading to a sovereign debt crisis. Also, in some cases, governments might resort to printing money to finance their debt, which can lead to hyperinflation and erode the value of savings. Furthermore, debt crises can trigger social unrest and political instability as governments are forced to implement unpopular austerity measures, for example tax increases or spending cuts. They can also undermine a country's sovereignty and force it to seek bailouts from international institutions, often with stringent conditions attached. Finally, high national debt represents a future claim on a nation's resources. Future generations will bear the burden of repaying this debt, potentially leading to lower living standards and fewer opportunities. Here's where things get tricky in today's world. After years of low interest rates, governments got used to cheap debt, but with inflation roaring back in the 2020s, central banks like the U.S. Federal Reserve have raised rates. Now, servicing the debt is getting expensive. In the U.S., interest payments are on track to surpass defense spending. That's money not going to schools, roads, or science. And because much of the recent debt isn't going to productive investment, but instead to tax cuts, stimulus checks, or short-term relief, the payoff isn't guaranteed. Debt becomes dangerous not when it's large, but when it's heavy, when interest payments crowd out the future. So finally, how much debt is too much? There's no universal number, but there are red flags. Debt growing faster than GDP for multiple years. Rising interest payments consuming a growing share of the budget. Borrowing for consumption, not investment. Falling investor confidence, rising borrowing costs. Think of national debt like cholesterol. Some is healthy, even necessary, but too much of the wrong kind, left unchecked, leads to crisis. As citizens, we can't micromanage fiscal policy, but we can demand transparency, accountability, and wise use of borrowed money. Watch how your country spends. Ask: are we borrowing at a sustainable and prudent level? Are we investing in the next generation? Are we planning for tomorrow, or just buying time today? Are we thinking long-term, or just until the next election? Debt can be a bridge or a trap. The choice lies not in the number, but in the vision that guides it. National debt is neither virtue nor vice. It is a reflection of our priorities, our plans, and our politics. The question isn't just, how much is too much? It's, what are we doing with it? Are we borrowing to invest in a better world, or are we mortgaging the future to avoid tough choices today? Every generation borrows a little from the next, but let's make sure we leave behind more than just an invoice. Let's leave infrastructure, education, innovation, and above all, hope. What are your thoughts on this crucial debate? Where do you think the balance lies? Let us know in the comments below. We're eager to hear your perspectives. If you found this discussion thought-provoking and insightful, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more in-depth analyses of the complex issues shaping our world. And don't forget to share this video with anyone you think might find it interesting. Thanks for joining us today. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep the debate alive.